focused on the Big 12 Conference, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, everybody. Josh Neighbors here, Locked On Big 12 Podcast. And today I am joined by, number one, fellow Mizzou Tiger, Eli Lederman. Both just two Mizzou guys covering Big 12 athletics. Eli, you cover Oklahoma State football and basketball for the Tulsa World. We appreciate you giving us some time today.
Dude, thank you for having me. And it's funny you say that. I was thinking about it. I think both of us missed the Big 12 era at Mizzou. We were there for all the SEC stuff, and now here we are. I'm covering Big 12 football and basketball at Oklahoma State, and you're running the Big 12 podcast. There's some irony there that I'm sure somebody at the league office in the Big 12 probably wouldn't like.
Yeah, well, it's weird too. And also during this time where some of the schools in this conference are actually going to the SEC now, which is very it's very odd that it's happening. But this season for Oklahoma State football, it's just been one that it's really funny. So you started covering the team last in August, right?
Yep.
And I remember all the conversation about last year's team was the fact that Tylan Wallace coming back, Chuba Hubbard's coming back, their defense had a chance to be a lot better, and that was the Oklahoma State team that people had really some ideas about being a next level type team, and it didn't work out that way. Obviously, COVID had a big role in that, but injuries up front and just things, the performances weren't there. And I said at the beginning of the year, how in sports sometimes it's like, Bryce Harper leaves Washington and the Nationals win, right? The Capitals just never – I'm using DC examples because it's first off the top of my head, but Capitals never get over the hump, and they just kind of randomly did. It felt like the window was closing. Yeah. Things just kind of eventually end up happening at a weird time when you least expect it. The Braves won World Series. They win 88 games, and they lost Mike Soroka and Ronald Acuna Jr. This is one of those situations, right? It was like, well, this was kind of the transitional rebuilding year. But it turns out it's really not. I think with the way they've played, they can hang with anybody in the country.
I think so. I think going back to last year, the thinking was Chuba Hubbard, Tylan Wallace, Spencer Sanders, year two, that set up really well. And I think the defense we're seeing this year was sort of taking its first steps last year, but it just didn't work out. COVID, had impacts on every program, but this one certainly. The offensive line got hit with injuries, COVID transfers, and that derailed things. That didn't help first-year coordinator Casey Dunn any bit. And he spoke about how, and then really even into the early months of this season, he just never had a normal set offense at any point. But and then you go to this year, and you're exactly right. I don't know. The expectations were kind of all over the place. And it's funny if you think, if I laid it out for you and I said, I'm going to show you two offenses, and one of these is going to be 10th in the college football playoff early in November, and it's the one that has Tylan Wallace and Chuba Hubbard, or the one that has Utah State transfer Jalen Warren and Washington State transfer Tay Martin, and a bunch of freshmen having to feature a wide receiver, a backup tight end. And it's this one in 2021, and that's due in large part though to this defense that is deep. It's really mature. I mean, they had some guys come back who had decisions to make about coming back for another season. Malcolm Rodriguez, chief among them. They've got a former Missouri cornerback in Christian Holmes, who little fun getting to reunite with him. I covered him in Columbia, and
that's pretty cool.
The secondary has overcome losing Trey Sterling. I mean, he was a guy you looked at as a preseason, potential Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year. They lose him in September. And they've got Jason Taylor, the second, who's come in, and that guy just makes plays. And so maybe unexpected, but when we've seen it kind of culminate, and now it's November, and like you said, kind of like their chances with this defense against just about anybody.
Yeah, and the thing for them is, let's hit the playoff thing. That's the big thing everybody likes to talk about, right? And I don't like it personally. To me, I think there's so much, everything's framed in the college ball playoff. I think one, for narrative purposes, we just need to expand it so we can include some other people. But for them, for Oklahoma State, in my opinion, they're not out of this thing yet. They're really not. Their one loss, it's a game where you can say they, if we're going to go with the approach of, Michigan's better than Michigan State, right? If we're going to go with that, you're kind of saying, well, it's almost a fluke that Michigan State, kind of beat them. We think Michigan's a better team. Well, I don't think we know who is the better team that day between Oklahoma State and Iowa State. I feel like the referees kind of took that away from us because, look, there was a first down there. There's no, I thought it was a first down, But there's no guarantee they go down and make a field goal at least, right?
Nope.
The kicking was bad that
And
day.
not on that day with Tanner Brown missing
Right.
2 field goals already.
Exactly. So, but to me, it's like we didn't get the resolution there. So it's a loss, yes, but it's not a glaring loss. They lost at a place where no Big 12 team usually goes in and win. For some reason, Iowa State in September at home is different than Iowa State in October and November at home. And to me, you get a win against Baylor, right? They've got wins against Kansas State 6-3. It's a good win. Boise State on the road. I know it's not normal Boise State, but still good. Texas on the road. I know it's not normal Texas, but still a good win. And they're going to have a shot at Oklahoma, most likely twice.
Yeah, they really might.
I don't know. They probably. I mean, beating them once would be an accomplishment. Beating them twice, like that's the one-loss team I'm looking at. Then a one-loss Big 12 champion Oklahoma State with 2 wins over Oklahoma. I don't know how you don't let that team in.
Well, I think, this is probably just as maybe it'll be the next best argument for an expanded playoff, because fact is, if Oklahoma State really does, they win out, beat Oklahoma on November 27th, and then beat them a week later in the Big 12 championship game, they should, I think a lot of people would look at that and say they should be in, and really that they've earned a given, like they should be in,
right?
But it won't be a certainty. And, maybe they'll get in, maybe they won't. Who knows what's going to go on around the rest of the country. And I think it'll, maybe there'll be more of a cry for it, but, you probably couldn't blame the committee. They'll probably have some tough decisions to make. And I know the committee's not popular, but there'll be
smart individuals in that room, right? Really smart group there.
But the fact is, you would think that, they'd be 12-1 at that point with back-to-back wins over Oklahoma. That should guarantee you a spot in the playoff, but for the time being, it doesn't. But you go to that one loss. I was up there in Ames. That was one of the best football games I've seen, maybe in person in my lifetime. And unfortunately, the refs, I guess it didn't have ultimately an impact because Iowa State went down and scored on that possession. But you had the
taunting
penalty, which I think we saw a few times in the years we overlapped at Mizzou. I think Demarie Crockett got hit with at least 2 of those at games I covered.
Right, a couple of those, heading to the end zone.
Those are very Mizzou-y penalties, but I mean, fortunately, that one, at least in the context of the game, they made up for it. They scored on that drive. But for Oklahoma State, you hit one of those 2 field goals, that 4th and short where Brandon Presley really, I mean, if he didn't get it, he missed it by a few inches, and that might be
an inch, if that, right? If he missed it at all.
The camera angles that day weren't all that helpful, and so if that's the difference between a loss and not a loss, think about where Oklahoma State would be right now if they were unbeaten. They'd be hanging around. They'd probably be in that conversation maybe with Michigan and Michigan State,
or they'd be 10th because the committee doesn't respect the Big 12.
Well, I'd wonder if they'd be ahead of Oklahoma, at least because they've got some of those wins that Oklahoma doesn't have. Oklahoma's sat at 8th, and I think for them, if they win out kind of based on reputation, and at that point they would have the wins over Baylor and Oklahoma State, and then maybe Oklahoma State again, they'd have enough to get in, but they've kind of their schedule is backloaded, and it's not their fault. But I think Oklahoma State with those wins over Baylor, I can say Boise State, I mean, whatever that team is, going to win on that blue turf in a night game, that atmosphere, even players here said that was better than Texas and that Ames rivaled it. But that Boise State, smaller crowd, but, allowed 36,000 is maybe some days better than, double that without the same kind of crowd.
And it feels like they've had a lot of those really difficult games on the road. I mean, they played in Austin, they played at Boise, they played at Jack Trice. They've gone to all of those places, right? And those are not easy places to win. And what I'd say for this team, outside of the whole college ball playoff thing, is just generally speaking, like if they get 2 cracks at Oklahoma and they beat them once, that's big because they have had all kinds of trouble beating Oklahoma. That's Alabama. I'm going to say Oklahoma. Oklahoma. They've had all kinds of problems beating Oklahoma this year, in the past rather. And if they could get one of those, I think that would be huge. Also, like as much as I'd like to think of the idea of them beating Oklahoma twice, you're not beating Lincoln Riley twice. You're not going to beat Caleb Williams twice.
I think it'd be really that if we get that outcome, and it's looking increasingly likely, as long as there's no unforced error for Oklahoma State these next couple of weeks with TCU and Texas Tech, they're pretty safe with that Baylor loss last week. They've kind of got a little bit of a cushion. See about Oklahoma, but that to me, whatever the outcomes ultimately are, the idea of them playing on a Saturday here in Stillwater and then a week later kind of going at each other differently, it might be a case I mean, I guess for playoff implications, you can't afford that first loss. But
Right.
you wonder if both teams can afford the loss that weekend. What don't you show that you're going to want to show a week later in the Big 12 title game? But that's a hard thing because again, you can't. It's not the NFL where you can
Right.
afford a loss isn't going to hurt you in the standings. One of them loses that game, and the playoff kind of goes out the window. So there's that. But Mike Gundy and Lincoln Riley going against each other 2 weeks in a row would be pretty fascinating.
I mean, and let's get to this now. Like Jim Knowles going against Lincoln Riley, right? Because
that's the matchup right there.
Jim Knowles, he comes over from Duke, has a reputation, and I liked the move from this standpoint at the beginning. If your defense, a lot of the defense in the Big 12, the old Big 12 at least, the key was, all right, if you're going to get torched a bunch, at least force turnovers, right? And so when you're going to blitz the amount that Jim Knowles blitzes, you're going to get beat. Except this group doesn't really get beat a whole lot.
No.
And also at the same time, so like when you do get beat, you get beat. If you don't, you might be forcing a mistake, right? And that's kind of where you can win your offense the game. This group, blitz, no blitz, whatever you want to do, they just get after you. And also the big thing, and this is one thing that we don't see across college football, they're fundamentally sound. They are. I go back to the Texas game where Christian Holmes. There was an early screen, I think, to Xavier Worthy or Bijan Robinson, basically shed his block. I think it was Christian.
Yes.
Simultaneously while making a tackle. And I thought right there, okay, that right there tells you, all right, you're going to have to live with us all day. We're going to be making the right play all day long. And you see with Texas and Oklahoma, and Oklahoma's defense especially, like those defenses don't do that. And every single game this year, they've done that. I know Iowa State had a little bit of success, but like they hold them 24 points at home, and that's okay. Like you're fine. You're totally fine with that effort. So it just would have been in your impressions of how it seems like every single game. It's not a question of whether is this for real? Is this for real? They're getting better at this point, like every single game.
Yeah, like. I think that's a really good point about the fundamentally sound. And that tackle early in that Texas game was awesome, and it was. I'm trying to remember exactly the context of it, but it was at a point where Texas was moving the ball, and obviously they really moved the ball well in that first half, and that was where they got their offense from. But it was I recall that hit kind of derailed the possession, and you wonder if that play doesn't happen, Texas scores again, the outcome might be different that day. So that was big. But I think Mike Gundy has been hesitant all season, basically up until now, about the defense and just expecting it to be as good as it's been every week. He just teased, there's got to be a week, like logically. And I think we all kind of nodded our heads because like at some point they were just going to have a not great day, you figured. And they'd be kind of forgiven for that because they've carried the team to this point. But they really haven't. And that's where I think just those fundamentals and the maturity and the experience on this defense comes into it. But the other thing is I think this has been a kind of a slow build. We've talked to a lot of the players, and Jim Knowles has spoken about it as well. But when he showed up, I mean, he's old school. He's not he's eccentric. They call him the mad scientist. He's got his desk apparently is just cluttered. Brendan Evers last night was telling us about trying to invest in a monitor for him because he's just got his back hunched. But he's a little old school, and I think it took some time for himself to adjust to the Big 12, and as kind of Big 12 defenses were evolving, and he's been a part of that. But for this team to kind of mold to him, and so I think what you're seeing is not a flash in the pan, but this is 4 years of building with this group. I mean, these guys have been there. Again, Brendan Evers was talking last night about the very first meeting with Jim Knowles and how guys' heads were exploding at everything he was telling them. But those same guys who had their heads exploding that first meeting are now the ones who've been here for 4 years, and they really have bought in. And there's just this belief on the defense that they are going to do it every week. I mean, I was impressed to see them, I think, even raise the bar on themselves at West Virginia. I mean, that was I would argue, probably the most impressive defensive effort. Certainly the sacks stand out. I mean, 8 sacks.
Yeah.
Most of the Gundy era, like hard to look away from that. But they just, after that opening drive where West Virginia drove down the field and got their field goal, they suffocated them, and the crowd was gone. First,
yeah, that's what everybody was saying. It said the crowd was completely dissipated after that. Yeah.
First, it was the energy, and then they were actually gone. We had a view of it from the press box of like the parking lots, and by like midway through the third quarter, it was just a long line of cars headed out of Milan Pushker Stadium. And so that's what this defense can do. And it's why I think it's just kind of a safety net.
It was a soul-crushing performance. Like
it really was.
Think about like this too. Week before, Kansas has the fun week against Oklahoma, right? What happens the next week? Oklahoma State beat the brakes off of them from
they
the
didn't give
word
them any
go.
air.
Yeah,
Kansas could have come in, riding the high, and maybe the result would have been similar. And that would have been the week that, like, if OSU's defense let up and gave up like 17 points, 24 points, and they won 55-24, no one would have batted an eye. But they didn't give them an inch, and they ended that game sooner than it was probably going to end anyway. But by the end of the first quarter, it was done. And man, I mean, that's why I think, you look at this week, you got TCU coming. Chandler Morris just set the world on fire against
It's
Baylor.
not going to happen again. I can promise you that. Did you watch the TCU Baylor game by any chance?
You know what? It was overlapped with the OSU game. But I've seen bits and pieces of it. Yeah, I mean, I think there's other reasons it may not be replicated again. But I think
I would call it unsustainable. That's the word I would use.
I think another reason you'd think at least this week it won't happen again is because this defense, it hasn't mattered what an offense did the week before. But the week before OSU went to West Virginia, Jarrett Dagey threw all over Iowa State, which was previously probably the best defense in the Big 12.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at that, and they had 500 yards on the Cyclones. OSU shows up 133 total, 17 on the ground. It hasn't mattered who they've played so far.
Yeah, and the variety of guys step up. I mean, obviously Malcolm Rodriguez is the main guy that we all know, right? But Harvell Peelis had a great year. I think he made a comment a few weeks ago. I don't remember what it was. He's like, "Yeah, I don't get to tackle anybody because Malcolm gets everybody before they get to me."
Yeah, he steals the tackle.
It's and like you've got guys like that. Devin Harper, obviously, has been somebody that's had a huge effect on this season, right? You got guys like Colin Oliver, who's been a monster defensive end, and Brock Martin, who's been awesome defensive end. I mean, it's a well-rounded group. And even like you mentioned, like, they take some injuries in the back end. Like, I mean, how much does it really hurt them? They've still played at a really high level in the back end.
Well, I mean, it's you talk about that slow burn and two positions where they've had guys, the backups were experienced. So Devin Harper this fall slots in next to Malcolm Rodriguez. He replaces Eamon Agbambamiga. And you kind of wonder, like, that's a big loss. And Eamon could have come back. Mike Gundy's talked about that. And man, you think about that defense with him. But Devin Harper comes in, and he's a guy who probably had the talent to start over these years, but was always behind Eamon and slow burn, all that. Finally gets his chance, and he's one of the stars of this defense. Jason Taylor is kind of in the same spot. I mean, he's starting caliber and was starting caliber, in August, and has been maybe the last few years, but he was stuck behind Trey Sterling. Trey Sterling goes down, and you're not throwing in a backup who hasn't been around. It's not a freshman, even a highly regarded freshman. So they've got that. But you mentioned just the different storylines around the defense. Colin Oliver's a true freshman, and he's got all this raw talent. And they factored him into their plans because of that raw talent. But I don't think anybody expected this. But then across that line, I mean, he and Brock Martin kind of share the left side. Tyler Lacey on the right, Brendan Evers inside, and even Cody Walterscheid has gotten in on the action. And so there's just depth and storylines, and it's all made for one of the nation's best defenses. And it's why we're talking about Oklahoma State the way we are, this time of year.
All right, let's talk about the offense here in a second. But first, quick word from one of our sponsors here. It's our friends at McDonald's. McDonald's has always been more than just a place to get a tasty, affordable meal. It's where friends and family can go to reconnect. It's where classmates can meet up, and they'll have dependable Wi-Fi and endless supplies of French fries and McFlurries. Also, I'm not sure about you, Eli, but like I associate McDonald's all the time with college football. I feel like my road trips to college football games just start with a McDonald's, a sandwich to start the day. So McDonald's, we are really thankful they're sponsoring this podcast this year. You guys know the jingle. I'm horrible at it. You guys know McDonald's. I'm loving it. All right, let's talk about Oklahoma State's offense. So I am a huge Spencer Sanders guy. I believe he has got a lot of talent. When I say a lot of talent, I mean I think he can be an NFL quarterback. I think he has that kind of athletic ability and arm strength. The decision making has got to get better. The interception last week, it was like it was the right choice. The screen obviously was, I think it was a screen pass on that one.
Mm-hmm.
we got to work on flight path of the ball there. It's either going to be around Stills or over top of Stills. It was an incredible
Not in the
play,
direction of Stills. Yeah.
directly right at Stills, and that's the problem. Still, that's the problem with with him. It's just his decision making, and you just have moments of brilliance, and you have games like last year. The Texas game was the one everybody uses, where he just they were moving the ball like crazy, and he just made a lot of bad decisions. To me, I think what we established is this: it's never going to be the most efficient passing effort from him, but it can be very effective. And I think what we've seen is his relationship with Tay Martin is clearly a strong one. Those two guys have put in a lot of time into what they've done, because I'm not a fan of goal line fades except when those two do it. They've got Sanders has that throw down, and Tay just kind of knows where it's going to be, and he does a great job of kind of working and then locating the football and depending on Sanders to put it in the right place. So I think there's that where we've seen certain steps of development, but like to me, when the rubber meets the road, and it will meet the road against Oklahoma, and they're going to need scores probably much like the Iowa State game to win a game. It's an OU team once or twice.
Yep.
Can he do it against in that situation is the big question. He did it against Texas, right? He did it enough against Baylor. That was more the defense winning that game. Did enough against teams like Kansas State, right? He was able to do it enough against them. What do you think? Do you think that is it can be an affirmative yes? And what do you think the factors are going to be for him to make those plays late in the game?
Yeah, well, I'll split this into two parts because you pointed out the Tay Martin thing, and that is like spot on, and that's the biggest thing they've got in this offense, at least in the passing game. So shameless plug, I wrote about it this week at the Tulsa World.
Nice.
Go read, subscribe, all that. Support your local newspaper, support your local Big 12 newspapers. But they spoke about it. I mean, West Virginia was the perfect example of how good that fade's gotten. They went to it twice, but we've seen that a lot this fall. And those touchdowns on Saturday against West Virginia have been in the making since the offseason. Tay Martin got here in 2020 in August. So, I mean, just think about that. August transfer, hard to get into an offense. You're behind Tyler Wallace. COVID's going on. His first year in Stillwater hardly ever started, I'd say. He really only got his opportunities in the bowl game. And so he went into this offseason, though, in a position to claim the number one spot, as he has. And so he just went to work. And that was all stuff with Gundy, with Casey Dunn, but with Spencer Sanders, too. So they've been working on it. And on that fade, they spoke specifically on that all winter, all fall camp, and practice even right now. If they don't hit it in practice, they're going to stick around after and at least just get one. So they have it. And Tay Martin said now it's just second nature. So the touch is there. All of it's there. They've really gotten that, and it's their surest red zone weapon. But on that, Spencer Sanders, I think for him, and it's a big in part with this defense, like you can't separate it, I don't think. When you've got this defense that is going to support the offense as well as it is, you don't need Spencer Sanders to be out there throwing 500 yards, 5 touchdowns, having Chandler Morris days every week. You just don't need that from him. And that's a good thing, I think, for him and for the Cowboys. What you need is for him to make plays through the air, use his legs. I think that's maybe the most underrated part. A lot of people, you say you're a Spencer Sanders fan. I think it's quieted down, but in September, if I met an Oklahoma State fan, it's kind of like in St. Louis, like what high school did you go to? The first question's got to be, are you a Shane Illingworth guy or a Spencer Sanders fan? Because there was some real split there. What Shane Illingworth doesn't have, I think he's a very talented quarterback, is the running ability of Spencer Sanders. That's an important thing in this offense. It unlocks Jalen Warren, unlocks the play action, unlocks the passing game. So he's got that. And the biggest thing is you don't need him to throw for 500 yards. What you do need him to do is not turn the ball over. And struggled with that a bit in September. But over the last month, I mean, his last 2 interceptions, one was a tip screen pass. And I, like you said, could probably be better on that. But if it wasn't like an errant throw over the middle.
The fact it was intercepted is phenomenal play. That's
right.
why it was intercepted.
I mean, that could be knocked down and we wouldn't be talking about it.
Right.
And the other was at Texas, which I think probably went hard on him that day. He threw, it was on a play to Blaine Green. So a freshman receiver where Blaine Green turned one way and the throw went the other. Whoever that was on, never really got decided. But those were his last 2 interceptions, and that's over the last 4 or 5 games. And that is what they need from Spencer Sanders. If he holds onto the football, I mean, he did put the defense in bad positions and they bailed him out. But if you can keep the defense from having to defend in its own territory, because otherwise offenses don't get there very often, That is what you need. And then, as you put it, can he make those 1 or 2 plays? Can he, if you've got the ball with 2 minutes to go and you've got the field in front of you, can he take you down there? And that's where it comes down to, I think, as much him as the weapons around him. And that's why Tay Martin and that connection and Tay Martin's health so crucial.
Mm-hmm.
Brendan Presley has really come on over the last month. And before West Virginia, he had 5 touchdowns in his last 3 games. And then beyond that, you've got all these young guys, the Green twins, Jaden Bray, all of whom are getting in on the action, even Jalen Warren in the passing game. And so I think, it might be those Bedlam games, whether it's final game of the regular season or if we're in the Big 12 championship, out in Texas, where you might have to see Spencer Sanders, show some of that intestinal fortitude and move the team downfield. But I think they've probably found the perfect role for him complementing this defense this year. And that's what's gotten him this far.
Right. It's the management of having him manage the games, and also like, all right, this is when to use that playmaking ability. This is when you need to use those feet, and not put your defense in bad positions. Jalen Warren, they've given a little bit of a break to. Obviously, there's 3 straight games where it was 30 plus carries, I believe it was. And then this has been a bit more of a downtick. His performance hasn't been great, but it hasn't been horrible, but it's just hard to ride a guy that much. Do you think we're about to step on the gas again on the Jalen Warren experience? Think we're about to see that carry count get up and kind of a bit more reliance on him?
Yeah, well, I think, I wrote about it during the bye week that he was on pace for like more carries than all but 5 running backs in program history. And those running backs include like Barry Sanders, Thurman Thomas, Chuba Hubbard. Didn't seem sustainable. I mean, he didn't show any signs of stopping, but it just seemed like, man, they couldn't run him 30 times a game and still be getting the same production in November. And I think that's probably been part of it. But the other thing is, he was running that way when Spencer Sanders was struggling and when the wide receivers group was completely battered, and they needed it. They needed every single yard and every touchdown from Jalen Warren. And so over the last month, that's shifted a bit. The offense has become balanced, and his performance is that the numbers haven't been eye-popping in the same way. He's not getting over 200 yards and running 35 times. But, last Saturday, 4.9 yards per carry, 78 yards on the ground, got in on the passing game. He scored his 7th touchdown of the season. It was still a good performance. He carried the ball 16 times. And so he was just as effective, I'd say. But the opportunities, he wasn't called upon as much. And I think that's a good thing for the Cowboys because, I don't know if they're going to need to run him 30 times against Texas Tech or against TCU this weekend. But I think because they haven't burned him as much over the last month, if you're going to need to call upon him, and that might be one of those 2 Oklahoma games, the solution might be to run the hell out of the ball, keep Caleb Williams off the field, limit his opportunities. And that's when you'll be thankful probably that Jalen Warren carried 16 times against West Virginia. And maybe we'll see a bit more of Dominic Richardson or Des Jackson, especially I think if these games the next couple of weeks get decided early, you'll see Jalen Warren on the bench.
All right. I think you're spot on with that. I want to get your thoughts on some basketball things before we get out of here. One more quick word. More sponsors are our friends at betonline.ag. Head there today. Use the promo code LOCKEDON. That's LOCKEDON, locked on, to receive a 50% deposit bonus today. New slick interface there. Easy to sign up. It is free to do. And you can go to anywhere in the United States. So go there today, betonline.ag, whether it's football, basketball, baseball, Formula One, UFC, anything you want to get on the action on, they've got there available at betonline.ag. All right, so this is really funny for basketball, because you actually saw the same thing happen, the 2 programs with the NCAA, right? You were around, I think you were around for Missouri getting tagged with their
I was.
For their infractions, which were dealing with a tutor a few years ago. And they made the mistake that Oklahoma State made of reporting and complying with the NCAA. And Mike Boyden was very animated, obviously, and had some choice words. And I think he was spot on with everything that he said. I think the NCAA also made a conscious choice to slow down their own investigation because their biggest cash cow right now is the NCAA tournament. And I think last year having Cade Cunningham in the NCAA tournament was a priority for them. I'm glad they made that decision. I'm not glad about their final decision. But people seem to have rallied around Mike Boyden. And I think this team, I think he's a very good coach. I think it's hard, it's hard. This is such a difficult conference, but Mike Boynton seems like the most popular man in Stillwater right now.
I think so. I mean, he certainly, and I wasn't surprised at kind of the response at all. It was reminiscent of the way that Mizzou sort of cooperated, but then went at the NCAA. But I can say this, that obviously there was going to be emotion and frustration and disappointment that day. It was, I do think, a surprise to the program, and they were kind of dismayed up until that point that it had taken this long, that one way or the other, just to have it get decided 7 days before tip-off of season was pretty disappointing. But being one of a handful of people who were in that room that day for that press conference that everybody saw, I mean, it didn't take long for Mike Boynton to have a tear rolling down his eyes. There was some really palpable emotion in there. And I think that's part of what caught, the lightning in a bottle of the fan base rallying around, and they showed out a couple days later to an exhibition. Last night, it was a good crowd for the opener, but you bring UT Arlington in, it's November, it's still football season. We'll probably see the best crowds here come Big 12 season. Mike Boynton even said that last night, but I think he's got the fan base, and I think he's got this team. An unfortunate thing just for kind of player freedom of the whole deal is this decision comes down in June. Anybody who wants to leave can leave in the portal now. And I think even Mike Boynton would say, it was within their rights to do so. You bring down a decision like this 7 days before the season, where is anybody going to go? And so this group is here, and I think they've kind of rallied around. It was certainly kind of poignant that after that exhibition, so 3 days after the decision came down, Oklahoma State hosts an exhibition with Central Oklahoma. And after the game, Rondell Walker and Isaac Likely were the two players selected for post-game media. But if you've seen the photos online, the entire team was out there together. And so I think there's a bit of a rallying around it and making the best of this bad situation. And we'll see how that develops over the season. Mm-hmm. But as you put it, with a good coach in Mike Boynton and a team that has a lot of talent, but really has a lot of depth and length. And we were joking last night that if someone fouls out this year, you've got a carbon copy to bring off the bench. And I think that's what's going to make them. I mean, they're going to torment, I think, some of these maybe lesser teams in non-conference play, but with length, athleticism, defense, all those things that can just be kind of levelers. I don't see why they can't at least compete with the very cream of the crop in the Big 12. And I think they'll at the very least hang with Kansas, with Texas. We'll see what Baylor really is. And of course, then the biggest shame of that is that we're not going to get to see that on the biggest stage at the end of the year. And we know that already. But I think, for the games they've got, and it may make it that a Kansas game becomes their Super Bowl, right, for lack of a better term, because they don't have much else. I think they've got the talent to kind of hang in those games. And that's going to be fun to watch, even knowing that carrot at the end of the season's gone.
Yeah. And I mean, these guys are going to have great opportunities. And here's the thing is, it's not like Oklahoma State's a place you can basically get to the NBA now from anywhere, but Cade Cunningham was just at Oklahoma State. He's number one pick. And these guys, there's a lot of talented players. Like you mentioned, Bryce I think he was a 5-star when he was. Yeah. And he's now there. Right. And Isaac Likely's back for his 25th year of college. It feels like he's still there as well, too.
He's on the Perry Ellis plan. Yeah.
Right. He's in the Perry Ellis plan. Yeah. And then obviously Avery Anderson is back there. And like you talked about, the question is, and I think the answer is they'll be fine, but the big question is late in the season, right? A couple losses in a row, January, maybe you're banged up, maybe, early February, a little banged up. There's no light at the end of the tunnel necessarily. How motivated is your team? And that's a challenge. I think that's a challenge that Mike Boynton's, pretty, I think after we saw the other day, it's pretty clear that that's the kind of challenge that it's something that he can handle, right? Getting the guys to rally around and getting them to handle a kind of situation like that.
Yeah, I think, certainly no program wants this to happen to them, but this might be one of the kind of the perfect program for it to happen to, because you've got a coach who has built a culture here, as you said, that can attract NBA. Cade Cunningham came here, and he came here knowing that the postseason might not happen for him last year, and until the appeal kind of got drawn out. Mike Boynton's the kind of coach who I think can keep a team going through this. I think a senior leader like Isaac Likely, who has, I saw it when I was at Big 12 Media Day, his relationship with Rondell Walker, but he's got the respect, I think, of every single guy on that team. And he's going to be a voice for kind of what's left there for them to accomplish. And you do, I think last night you saw even Musa Cisse, who we didn't even mention him in kind of that whole cast of newcomers. I mean, he was the best guy last night against UT Arlington, and he's brand new here. He got here in July. If anybody would maybe be, forgiven for just kind of pulling out and not, buying in, it might be a guy like him, just based on when he got here. He's tweeting things out, and so they've kind of got something brewing. And like you said, it's early days. It's easy to drum up all that emotion now when things are good, and you've got kind of the entire country on your side. We'll see after a couple losses in February, but I do think there's a team equipped for it. It might be this group with that head coach.
All right, Eli, where can people find you and your work, and what are you working on right now?
Well, you can find me online or on Twitter at by Eli Lederman. And most days, especially this time of year, there's not a lot of days off. Every day at the Tulsa World. Find us online, subscribe. I've got coming out tomorrow so I don't know when this runs, but Thursday online in the paper, a kind of look back on Barry Sanders, who's having his name put up in the Ring of Honor, and a statue coming out this week. So got words from Barry Switzer in there, from Pat Jones, a bunch of folks from back in the day on that 1988 season. And really the question being, can his rushing record ever be broken? Most people don't think so, but have a read. And next, I can say that in the lead up to Bedlam, we talked about Malcolm Rodriguez. I'll have something pretty good on him coming up as well.
Awesome. Eli Lederman, we appreciate your time, man. Thank you so much.
Hey, man. Thank you for having me anytime.